The Jewish Centre for Law and Justice has been opened up in order to assist those in the Jewish community who seek justice by appearing at the Royal Commission, putting in a submission at the Royal Commission, or seeking recourse against some of the horrific anti-Semitism that has been ripping through our community, certainly for the last 2.5 years, and we know for a lot longer. With me on this episode of Behind the Headlines, we're really privileged to have CEO Alessandra Steele, Ali, who's joining us to talk about the work of the centre, how it started, what it's doing, and what its remit in the future looks like. So, Ali, welcome to Behind the Headlines.
Thank
Thank
you,
you for
Adam.
joining. And let's start with a bit of your background and where do you come from and what got you into this role?
Well, I started at JCLJ just over a year ago when it was just an idea and a board, and built what we felt was really important, an organisation that is designed to harness the law to combat anti-Semitism in line with fundamental Australian values. And my background is I'm a media lawyer. I was working at the ABC immediately prior, and I really felt that there was not enough action happening on the legal front with respect to anti-Semitism. I could, for obvious reasons, I could see and feel it building. I could see it in my own, I could see the ramifications of it in my own neighborhood, which is very Jewish neighborhood. I would see Hamas graffiti on the streets, and I'd think to myself, how are people thinking it's okay to graffiti Hamas in a Jewish neighborhood? And it really felt like it was a missing piece because well, at least we couldn't see much happening in the way of legal action with respect to the kinds of things that were being said about our community.
Yeah, it's been
Uh,
so sad, hasn't it? Ali, tell us about the work now of the Jewish Centre for Law and Justice. What does the centre actually do, and how does that assist Jewish Australians at this time?
So, as I said, we were established in response to what we saw as anti Semitism at crisis point. Not just in Australia, in Western democracies. Obviously, what we can control is in our sphere in Australia. And that was a year ago. And sadly, Bondi confirmed that it really was as bad as we thought. There's been a decay in social cohesion that has created permission structures for anti Semitism to reach these highs. And so the work that we do is providing legal support for people fighting or experiencing anti Semitism, so Jews and their allies, to combat anti Semitism in all its forms. So that has sort of expanded out as the scene has changed. We built a community legal service where Jews and allies can come to get legal advice if they've got concerns of having witnessed or experienced anti Semitism. And we've got dedicated employment and other lawyers to assist with that. And then we have another arm that looks at appropriate public interest litigation to set the standard, really, to make sure that these matters are ventilated and that there's accountability for people who are engaging in anti Semitism in our community. I think one of the really hard things for me to watch has been the lack of accountability that's happened for the kind of conduct that has been allowed. And so that's where we are focused. And then, of course, the Royal Commission, we've been actively involved since the Bondi attack in supporting victims. And I think there's a unique opportunity, with respect to the Royal Commission to have a strategic impact, which is really our aim. It's one thing to help individuals, that's really important. And I think that there was a real gap. But we really want to make sure that the work we do has a strategic impact and actually moves the dial on anti Semitism.
So, when you talk about strategic impact and the work that you're doing in the Royal Commission, can you give us some examples of some of the things that you're doing that you really aim to make that impact?
Yes. So we obviously have some awareness from the work that we do around the areas of life, the kinds of rhetoric that are driving uh, the growth in anti-Semitism in our community. And so we are particularly interested in those areas, in being active in those areas, one of which is activism, so social activism. The kind of rhetoric that comes out of the anti-Israel political movement has been very damaging. And that is an area where we felt had been really no accountability. And so we supported Menachem Vorsheimer in his case against Hashtaya about the chant All Zionists are terrorists. And that we had a great outcome early this year where the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal found that that chant at those rallies was in breach of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, which means basically it was racial vilification. And it did set a standard. It made some of these protest organisers reassess the use of the word Zionist in those contexts. We presented expert evidence to the tribunal about what Zionism means. I think that one of the gaps is that there is a disinformation campaign around what Zionism is, and it is a deliberate one that is designed to confuse the public about what the goals of that movement is. And the great thing about the courts is, of course, it's one of the last places or one of the last institutions in our society that still cares about objective truth. So if you present the evidence to a court, it won't always be the case, but most of the time it will be assessed on its merits. And we got a great outcome in that case.
Yeah. Uh, while we're speaking, and I'll come back to the legal system, while we're speaking about chanting and slogans, globalize the intifada, fit to the sea. We debate them and we talk about them culturally and morally, but legally,
Mm.
how do you think we can deal with them? And how would you like Australians to actually react to these phrases?
Yes. Well, one would think that glorifying violence and terrorism, promoting it, would provoke some kind of reaction in the broader public. It's, again, one of those great mysteries, how it is the case that it's sort of been allowed to proceed by the public without, before we get to the legal, morally, how our community feels comfortable with glorifying and calling for violence against civilians, which is what terrorism is, it's perplexing. And I think, again, we come back to this permission structure issue, which is if there is no accountability, if no action is taken, if no one stands up, then how the permission structure is set for that to continue and to escalate. I think that is what the New South Wales Parliament realised after December 14. They had a parliamentary inquiry into slogans, and in Queensland, they've actually banned Globalise the Intifada and From the River to the Sea. And funnily enough, though, in New South Wales, they had the inquiry. There was a lot of activity about it, and it seems to have stalled, even though the inquiry recommended criminalising Globalise the Intifada. JCLJ's view on these slogans is that there is a real issue with calling for hatred, promoting or glorifying violence. I don't, and we don't think that criminalizing particular slogans is the answer because it's very easy to pass them. But I think as a community, we need to look carefully about slogans that are calling for violence, promoting violence, or glorifying violence. Those things need to be looked at really carefully. How to manage them is a real question against the community's right to freedom of speech. But in that area, of course, we're balancing safety, community safety against
So,
those things.
so you get a call after this from the Attorney
Mm.
General, and the Attorney General says, guide me in my legislation that we're thinking of to ban glorification of violence through street chants and slogans. What's the advice you give the AG, Ali?
Well, I'd tell her she's on the right track.
Excellent.
And I think that, obviously they'll need to take careful constitutional advice, because the worst thing you can do is put in legislation that just gets overturned. They need to look at it really carefully. But I think if you are focused on violence and safety and security, you're on pretty solid ground constitutionally. Whereas if you're just talking about arbitrary words, it is harder. So, my personal view is that an approach that focuses on violence and violence and not on offense and harm
Mm.
is the appropriate approach. And I think it is at the heart of what our genuine concerns are about those slogans.
Yeah, we know that,
Mm.
right? We know that clearly. But one of the recurring tensions, not only in Australia, but, recurring across democratic societies, right across, is the idea of is the balance of free speech while protecting minorities from intimidation and hate. The subtext there is no other minority seems to be carrying that sort of burden for any conflict anywhere else in the world, but we happen to be so. Okay, so we've got to find that balance between protection and free speech. So where do you believe Australia right now gets that right? And I guess the harder question is, where do you think we get it wrong?
Adam, the Australian laws on racial vilification are not bad. They are pretty well balanced against freedom of speech. They've been tested constitutionally and been found to be compliant with the implied protection. And so the issue, I don't think, is actually the law. Yes, there's probably around the edges, there's some work to be done in looking at how racism and in particular anti-Semitism is developing and making sure that the laws are adapted to the way that contemporary anti-Semitism manifests. But I think been a real issue in enforcement, that there has been minimal enforcement, minimal accountability. And so while we have reasonable laws protecting minorities, we've had almost a paralysis in dealing with it, which I think, we can't really answer to why that is, but part of it is because of the way the narrative has been shaped as a human rights narrative. So it's almost there's been this use of the human rights narrative against the Jewish community. And so the institutions of human rights on the other side have found it difficult to grapple with that tension.
And I want to come back to that, but your point about, and I will come back to that, but
Oh.
your point about a lack of desire, I'm going to use my language, what I think I'm hearing, a lack of desire to prosecute. Is that not just that there's a narrative issue that is conflating the problem? How much of this issue is a police and a public prosecution problem from just a lack of desire to do what might be hard or might be institutionally biased? I know that's a terrible word, but how much of it is just the police going, actually, we couldn't be bothered. We're not interested. It's too hard. We don't have the resources. It'll blow over.
So, Adam, a great example is the doxing of the Jewish creatives on WhatsApp very early on in the piece. I think it happened late 2023.
Yeah.
So, right after October 7, the WhatsApp chat was leaked. It had the names of 600 Jewish creatives and academics. And it was then used to create a list that was used to harass and torment members of that group. And as a result, the government actually put in place doxing laws for the first time, which, by the way, there have been no charges since under that legislation. So not only that, there was a provision that existed at the time called using a carriage service to menace and harass under the Commonwealth Criminal Code. And no, and that was perfectly appropriate. It's not about race. It's about using the internet or a telephone to menace or harass somebody, or threaten them. And so what's curious is that despite many reports, nobody was charged under that legislation either. And so there's this complete lack of action, and you've really gotten to the heart of it, which is it appetite? What is it that's driving the lack of action? And I mean, it's hard for us to know from the outside what's driving it.
What's your call?
I have some sympathy for the police with the different types of matters that they see, perhaps not appreciating the seriousness of racial vilification in the context of investigating things like domestic violence, terrorism charges, war crimes, you know. So I have some sympathy for the sort of the workload triaging that they would have to do, that they may not it would seem low level, these things on their own, yet cumulatively they have had a huge impact on our community, and the cumulative effect of the inaction has really created the permission structure that we see now. And so, there's a structural issue there. Is it intentional? I can't speak to the attitudes of the police. I do think that they try to do the right thing and they are busy and they put their lives on the line frequently. Do they have the information, the education, and the awareness and the resources to do the right thing by our community? I think those are really, really important things for the Royal Commission to look into.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, yeah, and that is right. I mean, when it gets
Yeah.
to fourth block, I think as Peter Wertheim has illuminated us last episode, the fourth block is institutional accountability.
Yeah.
Speaking of institutions, Ali, speaking of institutions, let's dissect the university sector a
Yes.
little bit, all right?
Yes.
Let's talk about, they've emerged repeatedly as flashpoints. I'm reminded of a comment very early on in an interview with Philip Mendes. And Philip said to us, Adam, I think they were slow to act because they didn't understand the nature of the threat that was happening. They saw it as political, not racial, which in fact, it has become. That was his view. You know what? We talked about that over a year ago, and there's still some universities very, very slow
Uh,
to act on this. Some disaster, like Sydney University, we know that. From your vantage point at the centre, are Australian universities failing merely in governance, or are they failing in moral clarity as well?
Well, Adam, I think the question is even bigger than that. I don't think it's just about governance or moral clarity. There's a systemic issue. It's not just one university, it's across the whole sector. And, the questions of governance and moral clarity are live. But I think there is a real issue to investigate regarding foreign interference in our university sector. There's a study by Institute of Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy,
It's
ISGAP.
that, yeah.
Yes, that reported that Qatar had funneled $1 trillion into US universities. Qatar is the single biggest donor to US universities. And they found that the receipt of undocumented money by universities was correlated to increased anti Semitism on campus. And we have here in Australia 20 Australian universities with collaborative projects with Qatar. And we had the Federal Education Minister cancelling 13 research collaborations on the grounds of national security just last week. I think the issue is much bigger than just governance in universities. I think we've probably been, as Australians and probably across the Western world, a little bit slow to recognise the kind of influence that financial support for this sector can have on really every sector of our community, because the universities are educating journalists, lawyers, teachers. And so it's almost could be a seeding point for anti Semitic views. And it's catching people at a very susceptible time in
Yes.
their development as
I
people.
recall the arguments with lecturers many years ago, some of them from the hard left who I did a course in American politics, and it was, I'll just use the word unbalanced.
Ah,
And it's been going on for quite a while. But, as you talk about ISGAP's report and the influence of foreign money on universities, we had the Confucius Institutes with China doing the same thing, and we called that out and banned them all, and that was easy to do that.
Mm.
I'm reminded of unfortunately, the late great Abe Foxman, when he wrote after, I think it was early in 2024, he said, "We made an error. The Jewish community made a significant error. We were very successful in the West, and we gave money in thank you and to build up the democratic project. But we did it without strings attached. We did it because we believed it was right. We gave to the arts sector. We gave in huge endowments to the universities. We gave it to Middle East Studies Association and said, do what you have to do." And now the Qatari and other money has come in, and they all have strings attached.
Mm.
They all have strings attached. And we made an error, and if you could call it that. And it's a really sad projection that, in fact, we're paying the price for that in that sense.
Although what you describe, Adam, is what's amazing about our community is the generosity and the faith in education as a driver of tolerance and respect. And there's something sad and beautiful in what you're describing.
Mm. I was brought up with that too, be thankful for the society that has saved us from the worst.
Yeah.
I want to come to, while we're talking universities, one of the things I often hear is, criticism of Israel is conflated with anti-Semitism. Most of us know it's a misnomer because demonization and dehumanization, we know that, but it's used effectively against the
Yeah.
debate in order to shut it down. So from your perspective, where is a line clear on where legitimate criticism ends and anti-Semitic delegitimization begins?
So I think the line is so clear, Adam. I think I find it amusing that people find it hard to find the line. You've articulated it well. And I think Jeremy Liebler did it well in his testimony. The line is easy to draw. It's fine to criticize policies and conduct. Go nuts. Australians do it, or Australian Jews do it all the time. Israelis do it. It should be part of our democratic values to criticize, to debate strongly. That's fundamental to our system of democracy. If you are demonizing an entire people, spreading libels, tropes, falsehoods, making eliminationist claims, that's not political debate. That's anti Semitic racism. And it's happening every day in protests and online. And if you over focus on Israel and don't criticize the same or worse conduct elsewhere, well, you may have anti Semitic motivations, or you're at least contributing to the permission structure that allows others to be anti Semitic. And again, that's happening right now in the media, online, and at protests. And those are areas that are real risk areas for our community and for social cohesion.
I agree with that. But there's an issue here around intent versus impact.
Mm.
I heard it yesterday or at ALP conference. Adam, I'm not anti-Semitic. There's no room for blah, 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 blah. But we're merely engaging in political activism around our issues. I heard it. And I said, well, you know, as an Australian Jew, I experience intimidation and exclusion that comes from that criticism because it crosses the line. I can do that in a one-on-one. How should institutions navigate that distinction between intent and impact?
There's very few people who are racist who consider themselves to be racist. So I think that is why the law doesn't focus on intent when it comes to vilification. It doesn't call those people racist either. It says that you engaged in racial vilification. It's your conduct that's the problem. It's not your intent. You may have a malign intent or you may not. The problem with racial vilification and racism is not the person's attitude, it is the impact on others. And everyone knows that about every other form of racism except anti Semitism.
That's part of that permission structure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? It's just part of that. There's something different. There's
Yeah.
something yeah, we would have thought in a post-Shoah world, all this money and all this education, and I've argued this before, to what end has it been successful in illuminating Australia, our democratic society, on the dangers of allowing language to pop out like this? And I've got to say it, the more educated right now, talk about the neo-Nazi right, I'm talking about the regressive left, the more educated you are, the more you're probably exposed to this, the worse you are.
And they're completely blind to it.
And how did we miss it? How did we miss it? Ali?
Mm. Yeah, I think for someone who comes also from the progressive side, it's very hard to stomach because you feel like the very things that you believe in, the values that you believe in are being weaponized against your community. And it's very hard to stomach, and it's disappointing to see people who describe themselves as progressive so enthusiastically engage in hate speech. It's just remarkable
Yeah. And get away with it.
and get away with it.
And get away with it. Which brings us back to not getting away with it. The role of the Royal Commission
Yeah.
in a sense, right? And it does. It brings us right around in that circle, Ali. So the commission's underway, right? For the purposes of this, the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion. In fact, credit to Australia. No other country in the world
Yeah.
has dealt with this issue at anywhere near the political governance level that a Royal Commission is, right? Which isn't to compel people to witness and testimony. It's extraordinary. Anyway, you're right in it, right up to your neck in it. What have you found encouraging about the process? And what has or what is concerning you about it?
So I think overall, the fact, as you say, the fact that it exists, it's a world first. It's an opportunity to really explore via an institution that, I think we've all lost a bit of faith in social institutions as a result of the sort of last 2 years, but an institution that I have more faith in than some of the others to look at the facts of the situation, examine it carefully and with care. That to me is really so valuable because there's so much disinformation that is otherwise existing in the mainstream.
Peter
So,
Wertheim, if I may, sorry for interrupting.
yeah,
Peter Wertheim used the word empathy. He said, the commission has been looking at testimony with great empathy, and it was really encouraging to hear that. And I'm hearing that, I think, also in your tone of what the commission's been doing well. Is that right?
yes, I think that it has been a really important time for our community to see it taken seriously for the first time in a long time and to have our voices heard and not minimized or explained away. And that has been, I think it's been cathartic for a lot of us.
Mm.
And I think there's the potential for great change. We always, it so much depends on how things play out and how it's a huge issue that we're looking at in a very short space of time. The extent to which it can be done in the way that it needs to be done is probably the biggest challenge that I think the Royal Commission has. But I think that so far so good.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. So you're now not rung up by the Attorney General, you're rung up by the Commissioner. And Commissioner Bell says to you, Ms. Steele, I'm sure she would say it that way, Ms. Steele, what legal reforms do you believe now we should be putting in place coming out. And so I'm being silly around the question. Ali, what legal reforms do you believe are now unavoidable if we're serious about, protecting the Jewish community? The add-on phrase is preserving our pluralism, but just protecting the Jew. What do you think are, and there's two questions, what do you think are the unavoidable legal reforms that have to happen and the policy reforms?
Mm. So, legal reforms, as I said, I don't think the legal framework is too bad. I believe that the issue is in enforcement and institutional response. That's not to say that there are not areas that are completely unregulated that might need attention. And there I'm speaking about social media. And I'm actually also speaking about mainstream media because the truth is that our mainstream media has minimal regulation. Most of the commercial media is self regulated. The ABC and SBS do have some oversight from ACMA and they're publicly owned, but none of them have had much oversight with respect to what has happened with respect to coverage of Israel and Gaza. And that needs to be looked at because there is a social change that has occurred that has happened because of the propagation of propaganda in our country that our institutions appear to not to have been inoculated against. And
Well, the New
but
New York Times
yes,
hasn't been inoculated, let alone in, the network record, let alone little ABC. I mean,
mm,
extraordinary, extraordinary. You would think they've learned from what they've been doing the last 2 years,
yeah,
right? You'd think so. Like that photo of the young, poor guy,
yes,
poor boy, flopped, managed, lied about, and here they are again with another one. So it doesn't bode well, does it?
no, but I think that so I think social media is so that's a real, they call it a vector and it's an amplifier. And I think, one of the things that I took from the first block of hearings is the impact on children and the number of children, school age holding anti-Semitic views. Maybe they're coming from the parents. I think they're coming from online content. And these children have access to information like no one has ever had before. And there is zero content regulation over it. And we've got to be asking what is it that they're consuming
Yeah.
that is driving this?
I saw a study and I wrote about this. TikTok in the first 6 months after 7 of
October 7. Yeah.
it was 62 times, this is an American study, 62 times more likely to pick up an anti-Israel reel on TikTok than you are pro-Israel.
Yeah.
And it was just flooded. It was, anyway, we know that that is an enormous problem. Will the Royal Commission be looking at the role of social media? I mean, it's clearly, one of the important elements of this permission structure that you've described.
Well, I mean, I haven't been told that they will, but I am expecting that they will because it features so strongly in the material that I've seen that's going before it. So I would expect that we'll see some detailed examination of what's happening online and on social media.
Okay. You've seen a lot. I want to explore something a little hard.
Mm.
And in preparation, you've seen a lot of stuff go through. Ali, what's some of the hardest things you've had to deal with in some of the testimony, cases, material that that's come across your desk?
Without a doubt, and I think it was hard for us all to watch it. Children having racial abuse at school in places where they have no power to move away or handle it themselves is devastating to watch. It's devastating. And we have seen a lot of children experience that through our organization as well as at the Royal Commission. And that is something that is really, really troubling. One, children will hold these views and express them to their peers, but two, that the children that are experiencing it are in a situation where they are very vulnerable and powerless, and they don't necessarily have the structures around them to support them. And that's, that creates trauma that can't be undone.
Yeah, that's the heartbreak stuff. And we don't even have to say what it is because we know the language, we know the graffiti, we know the impact.
Yeah.
So, this conversation we're having is ultimately much bigger than just the Jewish community. Much, 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 much bigger. Mm. What does all of this tell you, not just about the rise of anti-Semitism, but when you put all of this together, the health of our society,
Yeah.
and not just Australia, but, you know, those of us who worry about it, liberal democracy too. And what does that tell you? And why should Australians who are not Jewish care deeply about all of this?
So I think about it like that I don't know if you've heard of this broken window theory.
Yeah.
There were a couple of social scientists. Yeah.
Giuliani did it in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a broken window on a building and you don't fix it. And the next thing you know, there's another broken window, there's graffiti, and before you know it, the building's dilapidated. And I see the issue of anti-Semitism and casual racism that escalates the same way. We're talking about a society that's showing signs of disorder and decay, and it needs to be looked at. And I know that if people outside our community might see them as minor instances separately, but cumulatively, we're talking about the decay of our tolerant society into a place where it's tribal, where people are demonized, dehumanized because of who they are and not because of what they do or say. And that's very far from where we want to be as Australians.
Yeah. It is the lesson of the Shoah. It is
Yeah.
one of them. It is one of them. Be an upstander early, as my friends encouraged to care would teach. Be an upstander about it. Lastly, you mentioned ACMA, the Australian Communication Media Authority, to which the ABC and SBS are,
Accountable to some degree.
yeah, well, maybe. Firstly, you may have seen, I've just written about ABC and SBS, who annoyingly reject the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And my point in my article was, I don't know any other ethnic group, any other minority whose self-definition of the hatred that is affecting them is challenged by another institution in such a way.
Yeah.
Could you believe it? Like, what is the Royal Commission going to say? You guys are off the planet? Like, how is that possible?
There is a self-reinforcing set of values in those institutions that makes them feel very righteous in those kinds of decisions that they make. And not only that, but, as I said, when someone asked me about the same thing, of course, they don't want to have a definition of anti Semitism that could expose their coverage to criticism. Of course, they're rejecting it because there's 2 years of coverage that could then be a benchmark that could be, their content could be benchmarked against. It's much better to have no definition.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that's ultimately the pragmatic reason,
Yeah.
because it makes them even more accountable with the internal microscope.
I think it's hard for them as well because they've got a journalist workforce
Are activists as
that are activists and feel very strongly about freedom of speech in fairness to them as well. And the question of the IRA definition has been politicized as being about freedom of speech. And so they've chosen their side.
well, Michael Gouendas taught us, that ex-editor of The Age,
Yeah.
journalism is now activism, and values come before truth and reporting.
Which
So,
we've seen across the world, not
which we
just
see
in
across the
Australia.
world. Lastly, you have on your desk or in your organisation a submission from the board of J-Air, which this program is aired on, because we've been waiting for a license from the Australian Communication Media Authority for 12 years a proper community broadcasting license. I just wanted to share it with our audience. There's no one individual act of anti-Semitism we can point to. We can just go for 12 years of obfuscation, delay, diversion, and it's ridiculous. And other community groups have received licenses, but not the Jewish community. So, Ali, we look forward to the Jewish
Sounds
Centers.
very interesting, Adam. I'd love to get my teeth stuck into that one.
I've tabulated all of the data,
Mm.
and I've spoken to senators and parliamentary members who spoke in favor of this in 2020, in 2016. Jewish community needs a license. We should be doing it. Not one thing, but 12 years of it. And the minister's office, silence.
Well, the one ACMA decision that is loosely connected to anti Semitism relates to a community radio station in Sydney that treated a volunteer very poorly. And the ACMA made a breach finding against that radio station. So
So
they
let's
should
make
be
a
looking
finding.
for.
Let's make a finding against ACMA. So I look forward to your help. And on that note, audience, we now have a Jewish legal service in Australia. Thank God. You have an issue, you witness something, you experience something, make a headline to, and what's the website, Ali?
www.jclj.org.
jclj.org.
Yeah.
Make a beeline. There's a legal service ready to assist our community. We may have been a bit slow out of the block because I think we're all overwhelmed after October 7th. I don't doubt it for 1 minute, but our community is strong. We feel the weight of history on our backs and we feel strong for it. And Ali, thank God you're there. Thank God for the work of the Jewish Centre for Legal
Law and Justice.
Law and Justice. I always get that confused. Jewish Centre for Law and Justice. Long may you continue to help and serve and shine a light on the things that are necessary to restore the health, not just of our community in this country, but our country as well. All strength to you and your team, Ali.
Thanks, Adam. And it's an honor to do it, really. It feels like really important work at this time.
It
And we
is.
really want to make a big difference.
Ali, thank you for coming on to Behind the Headlines. Look after yourself and be well.
Thank you. Thanks so much.